Augusto José Ramón Pinochet Ugarte was born on November 25, 1915, in the vibrant coastal port city of Valparaiso, Chile. He came from a solid, middle-class family. His father, Augusto Pinochet Vera, was a customs official whose own lineage traced back to French immigrants who had settled in Chile centuries earlier. His mother, Avelina Ugarte Martínez, was a strong-willed woman of Basque descent who exerted a powerful influence over the household and her children. Growing up as one of several siblings, the young Augusto was described by relatives and acquaintances as a quiet and reserved child. He received his primary and secondary education at various religious and traditional institutions, including the San Rafael Seminary in Valparaiso and establishments run by the Marist brothers. During his school years, he was generally an average student, more inclined toward physical activities and structured routines than profound academic brilliance. Despite his father's initial desire for him to pursue a traditional profession like medicine, young Augusto harbored a strong fascination with military life and national defense. This ambition led him to seek admission to Chile's prestigious military college in Santiago. His early attempts faced hurdles, but with persistence and the steadfast support of his mother, he was accepted into the institution. Entering the military school marked a major turning point in his life, removing him from the quiet coastal environment of his youth and immersing him in the rigorous, highly disciplined world of the Chilean armed forces. Life inside the academy was defined by strict hierarchies, physical endurance tests, and an overarching ethos of national duty, obedience, and order. In 1935, after completing his coursework in military studies and geography, Pinochet graduated with the rank of second lieutenant in the infantry. Thus began a career that would span several decades within the ranks of the Chilean army. His early years as an officer were characterized by steady, routine postings across various garrisons throughout the country rather than immediate distinction or meteoric advancement. He moved methodically from one infantry assignment to another, serving in regional regiments and gradually building a reputation as a meticulous, hard-working, and disciplined officer. As he progressed through the middle tiers of the military hierarchy, Pinochet developed a deep interest in military education and geography. Rather than remaining solely a field commander, he gravitated toward academic and analytical roles within the military establishment. Over the years, he took on responsibilities as an instructor at military academies, teaching subjects such as geopolitics and tactics to younger cadets. His dedication to the study of geography extended to writing texts and participating in professional societies, blending military strategy with territorial analysis. This academic inclination allowed him to cultivate influence within intellectual military circles, establishing professional networks that would prove valuable as he climbed higher in command. During these formative decades, Pinochet's personal life also took root. In 1943, he married Lucia Hirayert Rodriguez, the daughter of a prominent public figure. Together, they started a family while navigating the lifestyle of an itinerant military household, moving between different postings across Chile. Professionally, Pinochet's worldview was increasingly shaped by the conservative traditions of the armed forces, a strict adherence to institutional hierarchy, and a growing wariness of radical political ideologies, particularly communism, which was gaining traction in various parts of South America during the mid-20th century. By observing the shifts in national politics and maintaining a cautious, guarded approach to his own career aspirations, Pinochet steadily positioned himself as a reliable, institutional soldier, masking the immense ambition that would later propel him to the absolute center of Chilean history. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Chile transformed into a crucible of ideological conflict, social mobilization, and deep-seated political polarization. For decades, the South American nation had prided itself on having one of the most stable and enduring democratic traditions in the region, characterized by robust parliamentary institutions, a free press, and a history of peaceful transfers of power. However, beneath this veneer of institutional continuity, the country was fractured by profound structural inequalities. Wealth and land ownership were heavily concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while vast segments of the urban working class and rural peasantry lived in deep poverty, enduring inadequate housing, substandard healthcare, and chronic economic insecurity. These long-standing domestic grievances coincided with a turbulent global climate defined by the height of the Cold War, where the ideological contest between capitalism and communism played out with intense urgency across Latin America. The political landscape shifted decisively in the presidential election of September 1970. In that closely contested race, Salvador Allende, a physician, long-standing senator, and co-founder of Chile's Socialist Party, ran as the presidential candidate for the Popular Unity Coalition. This left-wing alliance united socialists, communists, radicals, and other reform-minded groups under a common banner promising a peaceful, democratic transition to a socialist society. Allende secured a plurality of the popular vote, finishing ahead of his conservative and Christian democratic rivals. Because he did not achieve an absolute majority, the Chilean constitution required the National Congress to confirm the election result in a special runoff session. Following tense political negotiations and guarantees regarding constitutional adherence, Congress confirmed Allende's victory, making him the first democratically elected Marxist president in Latin American history. The advent of the Popular Unity government initiated an ambitious program of structural and economic reforms designed to redistribute wealth and reshape the nation's economic foundations. The administration moved swiftly to nationalize major strategic industries, taking state control of the copper mining sector, which served as the lifeblood of the Chilean economy, alongside coal, iron, steel, and a significant portion of the banking system. In the countryside, the government accelerated agrarian reform programs, expropriating large agricultural estates and redistributing land to peasant cooperatives. Additionally, the administration implemented redistributive social policies aimed at raising wages, freezing rents, expanding public services, and providing free milk to children in impoverished neighborhoods. During the initial months, these measures generated widespread enthusiasm among industrial workers and rural laborers who viewed the changes as a long-overdue realization of social justice. Yet, this radical restructuring of society quickly provoked fierce resistance from entrenched economic elites, landowners, and the political opposition. Parties representing the center and right, including the National Party and later the Christian Democratic Party, grew deeply alarmed by what they perceived as an unconstitutional expansion of state power and a slide toward totalitarianism. The economic strategy pursued by the government soon encountered severe structural bottlenecks. Rapid wage increases and aggressive monetary expansion, coupled with declining private investment and falling productivity in nationalized sectors, triggered severe fiscal imbalances. International pressures further compounded these domestic difficulties. Foreign credit lines contracted, and the United States government, under President Richard Nixon, pursued economic policies intended to apply pressure on the administration and prevent the consolidation of a socialist state. By 1971 and 1972, Chile was plunged into a severe economic crisis characterized by galloping inflation, acute shortages of basic foodstuffs, and the emergence of a thriving black market. Store shelves emptied, forcing citizens to queue for hours for bread, cooking oil, and other essentials. The middle class, initially ambivalent or open to reform, turned sharply against the government out of fear for their economic survival and property rights. Society polarized into hostile camps. On one side, workers, labor unions, and radical leftist groups mobilized in defense of the revolutionary process, occasionally seizing factories and land independently of state directives. On the other side, shopkeepers, professional associations, truck drivers, and students organized massive strikes and protests that paralyzed commercial activity across the country. Political violence began to permeate daily life as ideological extremists from both the far left and the far right engaged in clashes, sabotage, and targeted assassinations. The legislative and judicial branches of government locked into an irreconcilable standoff with the executive branch, as the opposition-controlled Congress repeatedly blocked presidential initiatives while the administration sought ways to bypass legislative roadblocks. Amid this escalating chaos, the traditional neutrality of Chile's armed forces came under intense strain. Political leaders from across the spectrum increasingly looked to the military, either to defend the constitutional order or to intervene as an arbiter of the national crisis, setting the stage for a catastrophic confrontation that would soon engulf the entire nation. As the political and economic crisis deepened across Chile during the early months of 1973, the eyes of a fractured nation increasingly turned toward its armed forces. For decades, the Chilean military had prided itself on a strict tradition of professional neutrality, viewing its primary role as the defense of national sovereignty and the constitutional framework of the republic. However, the unprecedented turmoil of Salvador, Allende's popular unity government, marked by paralyzing strikes, soaring inflation, and mounting civil unrest, placed an unbearable strain on this institutional detachment. Inside the barracks and command headquarters, senior military officers found themselves forced to navigate a rapidly deteriorating reality where the boundaries between civil governance and national security were dissolving. At the center of this military establishment was General Augusto Pinochet. By the beginning of 1973, Pinochet had risen through the ranks to occupy senior leadership positions within the army, culminating in his appointment as Chief of Staff of the Army. Throughout his career, Pinochet had cultivated a reputation as a meticulous, reserved, and intensely disciplined officer. He was not known as an outspoken political ideologue or a charismatic military reformer. Instead, he presented the public image of a dedicated career soldier whose life was entirely consumed by military studies, administrative competence, and institutional loyalty. Colleagues often described him as a cautious strategist who listened intently during meetings, rarely revealing his inner thoughts or political ambitions. Pinochet's rise through the military hierarchy had been steady rather than meteoric. Born in Valparaiso in 1915, he had entered the military academy as a young man, driven by a deep fascination with military history, geography, and tactics. Over the decades, he served in various garrisons across the country, authored instructional texts on geopolitics, and taught at military war colleges. This academic background earned him respect among his peers as an intellectual soldier who understood the mechanics of power and statecraft. Yet, despite his intellectual pursuits, Pinochet remained an establishment figure within the army, someone who understood how to navigate the complex internal politics of the military institution without drawing excessive scrutiny from civilian authorities. As the crisis of 1973 intensified, President Salvador Allende and his political advisors sought to shore up the loyalty of the armed forces by integrating military leaders directly into the cabinet. Allende believed that bringing respected generals into the government would stabilize the political situation, reassure the middle class, and demonstrate that the military remained anchored within the constitutional order. This strategy led to the creation of cabinets of national security and civil harmony, in which high-ranking military officers were appointed to ministerial portfolios. General Carlos Prats, then the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army and a staunch defender of constitutional legality, accepted the position of Minister of Defense. Prats attempted to maintain the delicate balance between supporting the democratically elected government and managing the growing discontent within the officer corps. However, General Prats faced an increasingly hostile environment within the army. Many officers viewed his cooperation with the leftist government as a betrayal of military principles and held him responsible for dragging the institution into the political arena. Within this tense atmosphere, Augusto Pinochet positioned himself carefully. Outwardly, Pinochet expressed unwavering loyalty to General Prats and the constitutional government, assuring civilian leaders that the army remained committed to its traditional role. This outward display of reliability made Pinochet appear as a safe, dependable choice to senior government officials who were looking for officers who would uphold legal continuity. Behind the scenes, however, the mood among the officer corps was shifting dramatically. Lower and middle-ranking officers, influenced by the worsening economic shortages and the near-total breakdown of public order, were growing increasingly radicalized against the Allende administration. Secret meetings and conspiracies began to proliferate within military garrisons. While Pinochet maintained a careful distance from these early conspiracies, his position as a senior commander meant he was acutely aware of the deep-seated grievances shared by his colleagues. He observed how the fabric of military unity was fraying under the immense pressure of the national crisis. By mid-1973, the pressure on General Prats reached a breaking point. Facing intense hostility from his own subordinates, public protests outside his home, and a deteriorating relationship with the officer corps, Prats realized he had lost the backing of the army. In August 1973, he resigned as commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, severing one of the most critical links between the constitutional government and the military establishment. Following the resignation of General Prats, President Allende looked for a successor who could maintain stability and command the respect of the armed forces. Believing that Augusto Pinochet was a loyal constitutionalist who would respect civilian authority, Allende appointed Pinochet as the new commander-in-chief of the Chilean army on August 23, 1973. To the president and his supporters, Pinochet's appointment appeared to be a reassuring guarantee of institutional loyalty. Pinochet even made public statements affirming his dedication to upholding the Constitution and supporting the lawful government. Yet, this appointment marked a fateful turning point in Chilean history. By placing Pinochet at the apex of the army, Allende inadvertently handed control of the nation's most powerful military instrument to a man who was quietly assessing the collapse of the state. Within days of taking command, Pinochet was no longer just a cautious staff officer. He was the head of an institution that was rapidly consolidating its plans for intervention. Behind his calm demeanor and public assurances, Pinochet began to coordinate with the commanders of the Navy, the Air Force, and the Carabineros, who had already been plotting the overthrow of the government for months. The weeks leading up to September 1973 were characterized by intense, clandestine preparations. Pinochet utilized his administrative skill and authority to unify the different branches of the armed forces, transforming disparate conspiratorial groups into a cohesive military force ready to strike. While political leaders in the government remained confident that Pinochet would honor his oath to the Constitution, the general was quietly positioning himself at the very center of the unfolding historic drama. The stage was set for an event that would shatter Chile's democratic traditions and alter the course of the nation's history for decades to come. The morning of September 11, 1973, broke cold and gray over Santiago, masking the immense historical rupture that was about to unfold across Chile. For months, secret communications and quiet coordination had bound together the commanders of the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and the National Police Force, the Carabineros. Yet, up until the early hours of that fateful day, the final shape of the uprising remained tightly guarded. General Augusto Pinochet, newly appointed as the head of the army just weeks prior, stepped fully into the center of the conspiracy, shedding any remaining pretense of loyalty to the constitutional government. The military machine that he had helped organize began to activate before dawn, moving with chilling precision to cut off communications, seize strategic roadways, and isolate the capital from the rest of the nation. As daylight spread, the citizens of Santiago awoke to an altered reality. Armored vehicles and heavy tanks rolled through familiar downtown avenues, their metallic tracks echoing against the pavement under a pale morning sky. Radio broadcasts filled the airwaves with martial music and repeated decrees from the newly formed military junta, announcing that the armed forces had taken control of the country to liberate it from economic collapse and ideological chaos. For millions of Chileans, the realization set in with profound shock. The nation's long-standing democratic tradition, celebrated for decades across South America, was collapsing in real time under the weight of military intervention. At the heart of the resistance stood President Salvador Allende. Refusing demands to surrender or flee the country, Allende had traveled early that morning to La Monda Palace, the historic seat of government in downtown Santiago. Accompanied by a small group of loyal security guards, staff members, and advisors, the president prepared to defend the constitutional order from inside the heavily reinforced colonial building. As army infantry units surrounded the plaza and took up firing positions behind stone pillars and street corners, the standoff transformed into a siege. Allende broadcasted defiant messages to the nation via remaining independent radio stations, vowing not to resign and affirming his profound faith in the ultimate resilience of the Chilean people. By late morning, the confrontation escalated from a tactical siege into a destructive assault. General Pinochet, directing operations from Army Command Headquarters, authorized a full-scale attack to break the government's last stronghold. Military units opened fire on La Monda with heavy machine guns and tank artillery, riddling the ornate neoclassical facade with shell blasts and bullet holes. Soon afterward, the roar of fighter jets filled the sky above Santiago. Air Force Hawker Hunter jets, sweeping low over the city center, launched rockets directly at the presidential palace. Thick plumes of dark smoke billowed into the atmosphere as interior chambers caught fire, destroying historic rooms and sealing the fate of the executive branch. Inside the burning palace, the situation became completely untenable. Amid intense heat, falling debris, and continuous gunfire, President Salvador Allende spent his final hours standing firm among his remaining defenders. As troops breached the lower levels and fought their way through smoke-filled corridors, Allende died within the besieged complex. His death marked the violent end of the popular unity government and shattered the political framework that had governed Chile for generations. By the afternoon of September 11, the physical resistance at La Monda had been silenced, and military patrols established absolute control over the smoldering capital. General Augusto Pinochet emerged from the chaos not merely as a participant in a localized mutiny, but as the dominant leader of a unified military junta. Wearing his formal uniform and dark sunglasses, Pinochet solidified his command over the armed forces, preparing to dismantle the democratic institutions that had enabled his rise. The events of that single day closed one chapter of Chilean history and opened a long, dark era of authoritarian rule that would reshape the nation for the next 17 years. The smoke rising from the smoldering ruins of La Monda Palace had barely begun to clear when the architects of the coup turned their attention from military conquest to the machinery of state control. September 11, 1973, had effectively shattered the democratic architecture that had governed Chile for generations, leaving a power vacuum in its wake. Into this void stepped the four men who composed the newly formed military junta. General Augusto Pinochet representing the army, Admiral José Toribio Merino representing the Navy, General Gustavo Lee representing the Air Force, and General Cesar Mendoza representing the Carabineros, the national police force. On paper, the junta was designed as a collective leadership body, a council of equals where power would be shared among the branches of the armed forces to guide the nation out of what they termed the Marxist crisis. Yet, Beneath the formal facade of collegial governance, a quiet and relentless struggle for supremacy was already underway, with General Pinochet positioning himself to outmaneuver his peers and seize absolute control of the state. In the immediate aftermath of the overthrow, the junta moved swiftly to dismantle the institutional pillars of Chilean democracy. Decrees issued from military headquarters dissolved the National Congress, suspended the Constitution, and banned all political parties that had made up Salvador Allende's Popular Unity Coalition, while placing other political organizations in an indefinite recess. The independent press was systematically silenced, with opposition newspapers shut down, broadcasting equipment seized, and strict military censorship imposed on all remaining media outlets. University campuses, long considered bastions of intellectual debate and fierce ideological struggle, were occupied by troops, their elected rectors replaced by military officers, and thousands of professors and students purged under suspicion of subversion. Labor unions, which had formed the backbone of support for the fallen government, were outlawed or placed under strict military oversight, their leaders arrested or stripped of their authority. The armed forces sought to replace the messy, contentious pluralism of democratic politics with the rigid hierarchy, absolute discipline, and unquestioned obedience of the barracks. As the state apparatus was rapidly militarized, General Pinochet demonstrated a profound tactical shrewdness that caught his fellow junta members off guard. Initially, the leadership of the junta was intended to rotate among the commanders, and Pinochet was seen by some as a transitional figure, a reliable general who had brought the army into the conspiracy at the 11th hour rather than its ultimate mastermind. However, Pinochet systematically consolidated his institutional base within the army, placing loyal officers in key command positions throughout Santiago and the provinces, while marginalizing potential rivals within the military hierarchy. He understood that controlling the army, the largest and most powerful branch of the armed forces, gave him decisive leverage over the other services. Slowly but methodically, Pinochet concentrated executive authority in his own hands, transforming himself from the rotating chairman of a temporary ruling council into the undisputed head of state. By the end of the first year following the coup, this concentration of power was formalized. Pinochet assumed the title of Supreme Chief of the Nation, a designation that bypassed the collective decision-making of the junta and concentrated executive powers directly in his office. Shortly thereafter, he was sworn in as President of the Republic, signaling that the military intervention was no longer viewed by its leader as a temporary custodial action to restore public order, but as a total foundational restructuring of Chilean society. Admiral Merino, General Lee, and General Mendoza found their influence progressively eroded as Pinochet centralized administrative functions under his personal command, and surrounded himself with a loyal circle of advisors and intelligence chiefs. Those within the military who dared to question his growing autocracy or advocate for a return to barracks life soon found themselves sidelined, retired, or dispatched to diplomatic posts abroad. The consolidation of Pinochet's personal rule was accompanied by a total militarization of public administration. Government ministries, regional governorships, state-owned enterprises, and municipal councils were systematically placed under the control of active duty or retired military officers. The civil service, built over decades through professional standards and political negotiation, was dismantled and reconfigured to serve the directives of the central government. Citizens who had once engaged in vibrant civic life, grassroots organizing, and national elections now found themselves subject to a system where every level of authority flowed downward from a single military commander. The transformation was complete. The pluralistic republic had been replaced by a personalist dictatorship, anchored in military might and dominated entirely by the ambitions of General Augusto Pinochet, setting the stage for 17 years of authoritarian rule. With the machinery of democratic governance dismantled and the military junta firmly under the personal control of General Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean state underwent a profound and terrifying transformation. The rhetoric of national salvation that had accompanied the military takeover of September 1973 quickly gave way to a pervasive, institutionalized atmosphere of fear. For the leadership of the armed forces, subversion was not merely a political challenge to be debated or defeated at the ballot box. It was viewed as an ideological cancer that had deeply infected Chilean society. To eradicate this perceived threat, the regime established a vast, clandestine apparatus of state security designed to hunt down, silence, and eliminate opposition by any means necessary. The pluralistic public square, once defined by heated political discourse, labor strikes, and vibrant student movements, was replaced by a grim silence born of suspicion, surveillance, and the constant threat of arbitrary state violence. At the heart of this apparatus stood the National Directorate of Intelligence, universally known by its Spanish acronym DINA. Formed in late 1973 and formally established in 1974, DINA functioned as an autonomous, highly secretive police agency answerable directly to General Pinochet himself. Commanded by Colonel Manuel Contreras, a loyal officer close to the dictator, DINA operated with virtually unlimited power and resources, cutting across the traditional jurisdictions of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and National Police. It established a sprawling network of clandestine detention and interrogation centers scattered across Santiago and the regions. Locations such as Villa Grimaldi, Londres 38, Cuatro Alamos, and the basement levels of the Estadio Chile were transformed into black sites where prisoners vanished from public view, stripped of any legal protections, rights, or recognition by the judicial system. The methods employed by DINA and other security branches were systematic and calculated. Arrests were typically carried out by armed men in civilian clothes, operating unmarked vehicles during the dead of night or in broad daylight on crowded city streets. Victims were dragged from their homes, workplaces, or university classrooms, hooded, bound, and thrown into the back of trucks. Once inside the clandestine centers, prisoners were subjected to brutal interrogation techniques designed to extract information about underground networks, safe houses, and political sympathizers. Torture was applied routinely and methodically, including severe beatings, electrical shocks administered to sensitive areas of the body, waterboarding, prolonged sensory deprivation, psychological terror, and sexual abuse. The goal of the regime was not only to gather intelligence, but to break the human spirit, ensuring that anyone who survived detention would be too traumatized to ever engage in political resistance again. Beyond imprisonment and torture, the dictatorship resorted to forced disappearances as a chilling instrument of state terror. Hundreds of political opponents, labor leaders, student activists, and members of leftist organizations were seized and simply vanished. The regime consistently denied knowledge of their whereabouts, frustrating desperate families who filed thousands of habeas corpus petitions in the courts, only to be met with bureaucratic stonewalling and judicial complicity. The uncertainty surrounding the disappeared created a uniquely agonizing trauma for relatives, who could neither mourn a loved one properly nor hold out realistic hope for their return. In many cases, the bodies of victims were disposed of in secret, dumped into the Pacific Ocean from military helicopters, buried in unmarked mass graves in municipal cemeteries, or hastily concealed in remote desert ravines, leaving a legacy of hidden grief that would haunt Chilean society for decades. For those who managed to escape immediate arrest or survived imprisonment, life under the dictatorship was defined by constant anxiety and the pervasive reach of the state's secret police. Informants were recruited everywhere, in neighborhood associations, workplaces, universities, and even among extended families and friends, fostering a culture of mutual distrust where ordinary citizens learned to whisper and censor their own thoughts. Political expression was utterly stifled. Public gatherings of more than a few people were prohibited. Curfew laws forced citizens off the streets during nighttime hours, and the postal service and telephone communications were monitored by military intelligence. Thousands of Chileans deemed politically undesirable were dismissed from their jobs in the public sector, blacklisted from employment, or expelled from universities. Faced with this relentless persecution, a massive wave of political exile reshaped the nation's demographic and intellectual landscape. Hundreds of thousands of Chileans fled the country, seeking refuge in foreign embassies in Santiago before boarding planes bound for Europe, Latin America, North America, and Australia. This diaspora included prominent politicians, artists, intellectuals, musicians, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been upended by the coup. While exile saved many lives, it also represented a severe cultural and intellectual bleeding for Chile, depriving the nation of its most vibrant voices. In foreign lands, exile communities formed solidarity networks, organizing international campaigns to document human rights abuses, lobby foreign governments, and raise global awareness about the dark reality unfolding beneath the surface of the military regime. Within Chile, the first courageous institutions to challenge this wall of fear were born out of absolute necessity and moral outrage. Chief among them was the Vicariate of Solidarity, established by the Roman Catholic Church under the leadership of Santiago Archbishop Raul Silva Henriquez. While many traditional social institutions cowed before military authority, the Church utilized its moral stature and legal immunity to provide a shield for the persecuted. The Vicariate established legal defense teams to file writs of habeas corpus, documented human rights violations with meticulous detail, and ran soup kitchens, medical clinics, and welfare programs for the families of the detained and disappeared. By archiving thousands of testimonies and keeping a meticulous record of state crimes, the Church preserved the historical truth at a time when the official media denied that any abuses were occurring. The human cost of this period could not be permanently concealed behind military communiques and state censorship. No matter how tightly the regime tried to control the narrative, international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the United Nations, began sending fact-finding missions to Chile, issuing damning reports that exposed the systematic nature of the repression to the global community. Despite persistent denials from Pinochet's government, which routinely dismissed such findings as a Marxist smear campaign orchestrated by foreign enemies, the accumulating mountain of evidence stained the international reputation of the regime. The state of fear that General Pinochet and his security apparatus imposed upon Chile successfully crushed immediate armed resistance and silenced open political dissent, but it simultaneously forged a deep, enduring reservoir of moral outrage and underground resilience that would eventually rise up to challenge the dictatorship from its foundations. While the clandestine detention centers and the grim network of state security enforced absolute political silence across the country, a radically different kind of revolution was quietly taking shape within the halls of academia, government ministries, and corporate boardrooms. The military junta had seized power in a nation deeply fractured by years of severe economic instability, crippling hyperinflation, acute shortages of basic consumer goods, and intense ideological battles over state control during the popular unity government of Salvador Allende. For General Augusto Pinochet and his inner circle of military commanders, restoring order required much more than the suppression of political dissent and the physical elimination of armed or unarmed opposition. It demanded an entirely new blueprint for the national economy, one that would dismantle the traditional model of state-led industrialization and protectionism that had dominated Latin American economic policy for decades. To engineer this sweeping transformation, the regime turned to a distinct group of free market economists who would soon become universally known as the Chicago Boys. This influential cadre of young Chilean economists had been trained primarily in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago under the direct intellectual tutelage of prominent neoliberal theorists such as Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger. Through a special academic exchange program established between the Catholic University of Chile and the University of Chicago during the 1950s and 1960s, these scholars immersed themselves in radical free market doctrines, monetarism, deregulation, and the absolute primacy of private enterprise over state intervention. When the military overthrew Allende in September 1973, these economists found themselves presented with a rare and unhindered authoritarian laboratory in which to implement theories that had previously been dismissed as academic extremes by democratic governments. The initial phase of this economic realignment was characterized by drastic shock therapy designed to arrest runaway inflation and stabilize the collapsing national currency. Guided by the principles of the Chicago Boys, the military government implemented severe fiscal austerity measures, slashing public spending across nearly all government ministries, freezing wages while prices were abruptly deregulated, and drastically reducing the size of the state apparatus. Thousands of public sector employees were dismissed from their jobs overnight, contributing significantly to the social dislocation of the period. At the same time, the regime initiated a massive program of privatization, returning hundreds of state-owned enterprises, factories, mines, and banks that had been expropriated or nationalized during previous administrations back to private ownership. Foreign investors were welcomed with open arms through favorable legislation designed to encourage international capital flows, while protective tariffs that had long shielded domestic industries from foreign competition were systematically dismantled. The structural changes extended far beyond commerce and industry, reaching deep into the fundamental social architecture of the nation. The Chicago Boys championed the complete overhaul of traditional social welfare systems, introducing radical market-driven reforms to healthcare, education, social security, and labor relations. A pioneering private pension system was established, replacing the traditional state-run pay-as-you-go model with individual capitalization accounts managed by newly created private financial institutions known as Administradoras de Fondos de Pensions. Similarly, public education and healthcare systems were heavily decentralized, paving the way for the growth of private clinics and schools alongside a severely underfunded public sector. Labor laws were fundamentally rewritten to severely restrict the power of labor unions, ban strikes in vital economic sectors, and grant employers greater flexibility in hiring and firing workers, thereby creating a disciplined, low-cost labor market that appealed strongly to foreign and domestic capital alike. During the late 1970s, these aggressive policies appeared to yield remarkable macroeconomic results, giving rise to an enthusiastic phenomenon that international financial observers and regime supporters heralded as the Chilean miracle. Between 1977 and 1981, the nation experienced a sharp surge in gross domestic product growth. Inflation dropped significantly from the astronomical levels of the early 70s. Supermarket shelves were once again overflowing with imported luxury goods, and a new class of wealthy entrepreneurs, financiers, and corporate executives flourished amidst a booming construction and speculative credit bubble centered in downtown Santiago. General Pinochet frequently pointed to these economic indicators as definitive proof of the correctness of his regime's course, arguing that material progress and modernization could only be achieved under conditions of strict political order and absolute executive authority, insulated from the chaotic pressures of populist politics and parliamentary debate. However, this glittering facade of prosperity rested on fragile and deeply distorted foundations. The rapid liberalization of the financial sector, coupled with a fixed exchange rate pegged to the United States dollar, encouraged a massive influx of foreign borrowing by domestic banks and conglomerates. Wealthy financial groups expanded aggressively through highly leveraged acquisitions, while domestic manufacturing industries, battered by the sudden elimination of tariff protections and an overvalued currency, collapsed in droves, driving unemployment to unprecedented heights. Beneath the surface of national growth figures, wealth inequality widened dramatically, and the social safety net protecting the nation's poorest citizens was severely frayed, leaving vast segments of the population to bear the brunt of the adjustment costs, while a small financial elite reaped the rewards of deregulation. The illusion of the economic miracle was brutally shattered when a severe global recession struck Latin America in the early 1980s. In 1982, Chile was plunged into one of the most catastrophic economic depressions in its modern history. Gross domestic product plummeted by more than 14% in a single year, unemployment soared past 20%, and significantly higher when factoring in emergency government make-work programs, and the financial system suffered a systemic meltdown. Major commercial banks and industrial conglomerates collapsed under the weight of unpayable foreign debts, forcing the military government into an embarrassing and ideological contradiction. The staunchly free market regime was forced to step in, nationalize the failing banks, and take direct control of major sectors of the economy to prevent total financial ruin. The economic crisis of 1982 served as a watershed moment that permanently altered the political landscape of the dictatorship. The myth of infallible economic management by the Chicago Boys was thoroughly discredited, unleashing widespread public anger that transcended traditional class lines and drew even middle-class citizens, small business owners, and professionals into open opposition against the regime. General Pinochet was forced to temporarily sideline some of the more dogmatic free market architects and bring in pragmatic economic managers to restore stability through more orthodox fiscal controls, currency devaluation, and targeted relief efforts. Yet, despite the devastating crash and the intense suffering it inflicted on millions of working-class families, the core structural pillars of the economic model, privatization, export-oriented growth, and private social security systems, remained fundamentally intact, institutionalized in a manner designed to outlast the military government itself. The economic legacy of Pinochet's regime remains one of the most intensely debated and polarized subjects in modern Latin American history. To its defenders, the neoliberal transformation laid the essential groundwork for Chile's subsequent modernization, establishing a stable, open, and export-driven economy that eventually achieved some of the highest living standards and macroeconomic stability in the region. To its critics, the Chicago Boys experiment inflicted profound and unnecessary social trauma, dismantled solidarity networks, concentrated vast wealth in the hands of a privileged few, and commodified fundamental human rights such as health, education, and retirement security. As the economic crisis of the early 80s gradually gave way to renewed political mobilization, the deep fissures opened by the dictatorship's economic policies merged seamlessly with the growing popular demand for the complete restoration of democracy. While the domestic economy struggled to recover from the devastating crash of the early 1980s, Chile's military regime was quietly operating on a much broader, transnational stage. The boundaries of the dictatorship's security apparatus did not stop at the nation's physical frontiers. For General Augusto Pinochet and his inner circle of intelligence chiefs, the struggle against what they defined as international subversion required a coordinated continental defense. During the height of the Cold War, South America had become a primary ideological battleground where traditional state borders frequently dissolved in the face of intense cross-border intelligence sharing and military cooperation. In this volatile regional climate, the Chilean intelligence service found willing partners among neighboring military dictatorships that shared a common obsession with eradicating left-wing political movements, Marxist guerrillas, and democratic opposition leaders. This clandestine network of cross-border state violence and intelligence collaboration officially took shape under the name Operation Condor. Conceived and formalized in the mid-1970s during a secret summit in Santiago, Operation Condor brought together the military regimes of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and eventually Brazil. Under the auspices of this sinister alliance, intelligence agencies across the Southern Cone established a direct communication network, sharing vast databases of political dissidents, exiles, and suspected subversives. The system allowed security forces to operate with near-total impunity across each other's national territories, effectively neutralizing the safety that political exiles had traditionally found by fleeing across international borders into neighboring countries. For the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, known by its acronym DINA, and its successor agency, the Central National de Informaciones, Operation Condor provided a mechanism to extend the long arm of the Chilean dictatorship far beyond national jurisdiction. Chilean agents traveled freely to Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Rome, and Washington, D.C., operating in the shadows to track, surveil, kidnap, and eliminate prominent critics of the regime who were living in exile. The network turned foreign cities into hunting grounds where exiled politicians, former military officers loyal to the constitutional government, diplomats, and journalists discovered that geography no longer offered protection from the wrath of the junta. The international reach of the intelligence services demonstrated a terrifying level of logistical sophistication, relying on false passports, diplomatic pouches, and the tacit cooperation of friendly foreign security apparatuses. Among the most notorious operations linked to this transnational network was the brazen assassination of Orlando Letelier, a former Chilean defense and foreign minister under the socialist administration of Salvador Allende. Letelier had been forced into exile and had become one of the most vocal and articulate international critics of Pinochet's dictatorship, mobilizing European and American political leaders against the regime. On a crisp September morning in 1976, while Letelier was driving along Embassy Row in Washington, D.C., accompanied by his American colleague Ronnie Moffett, a remote-controlled bomb planted underneath his car detonated. The blast instantly killed Letelier and fatally injured Moffett, sending shockwaves through the diplomatic community and thrusting the covert activities of the Chilean secret police into the glaring spotlight of American media and law enforcement investigations. The assassination in the heart of the United States Capitol proved to be a profound tactical miscalculation for the Chilean regime, irrevocably damaging its international reputation and drawing unprecedented scrutiny from foreign governments and human rights organizations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched an intensive, high-profile investigation that eventually penetrated the shroud of secrecy surrounding DINA and its charismatic, ruthless chief, Manuel Contreras. Investigators traced the conspiracy directly back to Santiago, uncovering undeniable evidence that linked the highest levels of Chilean intelligence to the planning and execution of the attack. Although foreign pressure forced the regime to distance itself temporarily from some of its more overt methods, the overarching framework of regional intelligence sharing and clandestine operations persisted, continuing to cast a dark shadow over the sovereignty and stability of the entire continent. As years passed, the full architecture of Operation Condor was slowly exposed through investigative journalism, declassified government documents, and courageous human rights advocacy. The uncovering of secret archives, such as the famous archives of terror discovered in Paraguay, provided irrefutable documentary proof of the systematic coordination among South American dictatorships to monitor, torture, and execute thousands of citizens. These historical records revealed a chilling picture of continental complicity, where human lives were traded across borders like commodities in a vast, macabre marketplace of state security. The revelations transformed the understanding of Cold War history in Latin America, shifting the narrative from a series of isolated national crackdowns to a coordinated international strategy of state terror. The legacy of Operation Condor became a cornerstone for future international legal battles and human rights prosecutions long after the South American dictatorships had fallen. The realization that state-sponsored crimes had crossed international boundaries opened the door for innovative legal concepts such as universal jurisdiction, inspiring victims' families and dedicated prosecutors to pursue justice across national borders. Decades after the bombs detonated and the secret agents slipped through foreign airports, the documentation compiled during the investigations of Operation Condor ensured that the architects and operatives of this transnational terror network could never fully escape accountability for their actions. It stands in historical memory as one of the darkest chapters of international cooperation, a stark reminder of how far authoritarian regimes were willing to go to preserve their power at any human cost. With the transnational machinery of Operation Condor operating in the shadows and the domestic opposition struggling under the weight of strict authoritarian controls, General Augusto Pinochet and his inner circle turned their attention toward a grander, more permanent ambition. For years, the military junta had ruled by decree, sustained by martial law, executive declarations, and the suspension of constitutional guarantees that had accompanied the 1973 coup. Yet Pinochet and his closest legal and political advisors recognized that provisional decrees and emergency powers possessed an inherent vulnerability. To truly solidify their vision of a restructured Chile, the regime needed to institutionalize its power and embed its political philosophy into the bedrock of the nation's legal architecture. They sought to construct a permanent framework that would outlast the military commanders currently sitting in government palaces, creating a system where the armed forces would forever act as the ultimate guardians and arbiters of national sovereignty. The task of drafting this foundational document fell to a handpicked commission of conservative legal scholars, jurists, and constitutional experts known as the Estudios de la Realidad Nacional, or the Ortúzar Commission, named after its president Enrique Ortúzar. Operating behind closed doors with minimal public consultation and no democratic oversight, this group spent years hammering out the articles of a new supreme law. Their mission was not merely to revise the historic 1925 Constitution, which they blamed for permitting the rise of Salvador Allende and the perceived collapse of democratic stability, but to completely replace it with an instrument of authoritarian tutelage. The drafters engineered a text that centralized vast executive authority in the office of the presidency, while simultaneously erecting formidable structural barriers designed to prevent any future resurgence of Marxist or leftist political forces. By the middle of 1980, the text of the proposed constitution was finalized and presented to the junta for formal approval. The document introduced a series of novel and highly restrictive political concepts aimed at institutionalizing what the regime termed protected democracy. Under this doctrine, political pluralism was strictly circumscribed. Parties adhering to totalitarian doctrines or advocating class warfare were explicitly banned, effectively outlawing the leftist coalitions that had formed the backbone of the Popular Unity government. Furthermore, the draft empowered the state to dissolve organizations, punish individuals, and restrict civil liberties if their activities were deemed contrary to the institutional order established by the military. Power was heavily skewed in favor of an executive branch backed by a powerful National Security Council, ensuring that the elected civilian politicians of the future would operate under the watchful, supervisory eye of the armed forces. To give this monumental document the veneer of popular legitimacy, General Pinochet announced that the new constitution would be submitted to a national plebiscite in September 1980. From the outset, the process was entirely controlled by the regime, creating an environment that rendered a free and fair contest impossible. The country remained under a prolonged state of emergency. Political parties were either dissolved or forced into deep dormancy, and public assemblies critical of the government were strictly forbidden. Opposition leaders, civic figures, and former politicians who attempted to organize campaigns against the draft faced immediate harassment, censorship, and intimidation by the state's security apparatus. The media, heavily censored and state-aligned, saturated the public sphere with official propaganda portraying the Constitution as the sole bulwark against communist chaos and economic ruin. On the day of the plebiscite, voters across Chile went to the polls under the heavy shadow of military surveillance. The logistics of the vote were managed entirely by the regime, with no independent electoral registries, neutral oversight boards, or transparent mechanisms for verifying the count. Opposition figures famously pointed out that there were no electoral rolls to audit, no independent observers inside the polling stations, and no official guarantees that ballots would be counted accurately. As the evening hours approached, the government-controlled media announced that the Constitution had been approved by a comfortable majority of the voting public, securing the legal foundation that Pinochet desired. Critics and international observers immediately denounced the vote as a heavily manipulated sham, noting that the reported outcome reflected the coercive atmosphere of a military dictatorship rather than the genuine will of the citizenry. With the promulgation of the 1980 Constitution, the Chilean dictatorship entered a new, institutionalized phase. The document was meticulously engineered to secure Pinochet's personal political longevity and to protect the military's corporate interests for decades to come. It established a lengthy transition period during which Pinochet would continue to rule as president, surrounded by a rubber-stamp legislative commission, while the military retained its supreme veto over state policy. Mechanisms were carefully written into the transitional articles to ensure that any future challenges to the system would face insurmountable legal hurdles. By clothing military rule in the formal garments of constitutional law, the regime attempted to transform its provisional dictatorship into a permanent, legally entrenched political order, setting the stage for a protracted struggle between the architects of the new state and a resilient, growing opposition determined to reclaim Chile's democratic heritage. The implementation of the 1980 Constitution did not extinguish the spirit of dissent in Chile. Instead, it drew the battle lines for a protracted and agonizing war of attrition between a fortified dictatorship and a resilient society. For several years following the plebiscite, the regime seemed secure in its authoritarian fortress, shielded by martial law, secret police surveillance, and a constitution meticulously engineered to preserve military dominance. Yet beneath the rigid surface of state control, the underlying realities of economic hardship, social fracture, and unyielding human suffering began to erode the foundations of Pinochet's power. The opposition, initially shattered, fragmented, and driven underground by the violent purges of the early years, slowly began to reorganize, finding new voices, new spaces, and new methods to challenge a regime that had ruled by terror for over a decade. The first major cracks in the dictatorship's armor were forged not in clandestine political backrooms, but in the harsh crucible of economic collapse. The neoliberal experiment championed by the Chicago Boys, which had initially produced a speculative boom fueled by foreign debt and overvalued currency, came crashing down in the cataclysmic economic crisis of 1982 and 1983. Unemployment soared to historic highs, industrial production plummeted, thousands of small businesses went bankrupt, and the purchasing power of ordinary working-class families evaporated almost overnight. The promise of national modernization and boundless consumer prosperity, which the regime had used to justify its brutal suppression of democracy, was revealed as a hollow illusion. Millions of Chileans who had previously remained politically passive or timidly supportive out of fear or economic comfort now found themselves plunged into acute poverty and despair. Out of this economic wreckage emerged a profound social awakening, spearheaded by sectors of society that the regime had underestimated or marginalized. Women, many of whom had organized soup kitchens, communal workshops, and human rights committees through the Catholic Church, became the vanguard of civilian mobilization. Organizations such as the Association of Relatives of the Detained Disappeared and various grassroots survival networks transformed churches, community centers, and neighborhood plazas into nodes of quiet, courageous resistance. They demanded truth, justice, and the return of their loved ones, refusing to let the state sweep its systematic atrocities under the rug. The Roman Catholic Church, under the courageous leadership of figures like Cardinal Raul Silva Henriquez and later Archbishop Juan Francisco Fresno, provided a vital sanctuary for persecuted dissidents, labor leaders, and human rights defenders, offering a moral shield against the absolute authority of the secret police. By the middle of 1983, the accumulated grievances of a suffering populace exploded into the open with the first of the national days of protest. What began as localized demonstrations against unemployment and hunger quickly snowballed into massive, nationwide eruptions of public defiance. Across the sprawling, dusty neighborhoods of Santiago, Valparaiso, and Concepcion, hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens poured into the streets, banging pots and pans, erecting barricades of burning tires, and shouting slogans demanding the immediate resignation of General Pinochet. The night skies glowed with the orange light of makeshift fires, while residents flashed V-signs from apartment windows and chanted freedom anthems that had been forbidden for a decade. The sheer scale and audacity of these protests caught the regime completely off guard, shattering the myth of total submission that the dictatorship had cultivated since 1973. The response of the military government was swift, uncompromising, and brutal. General Pinochet viewed the rising tide of public resistance not as a legitimate political challenge, but as a dangerous resurgence of communist subversion that threatened the very survival of the fatherland. He deployed heavily armed military patrols, armored personnel carriers, and massive contingents of the heavily feared National Police into working-class neighborhoods. Neighborhoods were placed under virtual military siege, subjected to violent raids known as rastrelages, where young men were dragged from their homes, interrogated at gunpoint, and subjected to mass detentions in open-air stadiums reminiscent of the days immediately following the coup. Curfews were strictly enforced, tear gas filled the air, and live ammunition was frequently fired into crowds of demonstrators, leaving dozens dead and countless wounded. Despite the deployment of overwhelming state violence, the protests did not stop. Instead, they evolved into a persistent, rolling cycle of civil disobedience that paralyzed major urban centers. Labor unions, led by courageous figures like Manuel Bustos and Rodolfo Segovia, reasserted their power by calling general strikes that brought key copper mines, transportation networks, and manufacturing plants to a temporary halt. Students at the University of Chile and the Pontifical Catholic University transformed lecture halls and campuses into hotbeds of anti-regime agitation, staging marches, rallies, and underground publications that mocked the dictatorship's censorship laws. Intellectuals, artists, and journalists tested the boundaries of state control through clandestine theater productions, satirical magazines, and cultural festivals that celebrated democratic values and human dignity in defiance of official intimidation. Internationally, the mounting wave of domestic resistance and the brutal government crackdowns severely damaged the Pinochet regime's diplomatic standing. Democratic governments across Western Europe and Latin America stepped up their condemnation of human rights violations, while the United States, navigating a shifting foreign policy under the Reagan administration, began to distance itself from the absolute autocrat. American diplomats and State Department officials, recognizing that prolonged instability in Chile could pave the way for a radicalized leftist revolution or protracted civil war, began quietly encouraging a controlled, moderate transition away from military rule. International human rights organizations, journalists, and foreign observers flooded into Santiago, documenting the regime's abuses and providing a protective international spotlight that made it increasingly difficult for Pinochet to operate with absolute impunity. Within the political class, the rising pressure from the streets forced exiled leaders and domestic politicians of various ideological stripes to begin cautious, agonizing negotiations to forge a unified front against the dictatorship. Moderate Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and even elements of the moderate left realized that defeating a heavily armed, institutionalized regime required putting aside past divisions and building a broad, pragmatic coalition. This coalition-building process laid the groundwork for future political pacts, uniting disparate opponents under a common banner of peaceful democratic restoration. They understood that the struggle could no longer be won through armed guerrilla warfare, which had been brutally crushed by the security forces through groups like the Manuel Rodriguez Patriotic Front, but through disciplined, strategic political mobilization. By the late 1980s, General Pinochet found himself trapped in a strategic dilemma of his own making. The 1980 Constitution, which he had designed to guarantee his indefinite rule, contained a specific transitional article that mandated a plebiscite at the end of the decade to determine whether he would remain in power for another 8-year term. What the dictator had originally conceived as a mere formality and a triumphant coronation of his authoritarian project was rapidly transforming into a perilous referendum on his survival. As the economy showed sluggish recovery and domestic unrest simmered just beneath the surface, the architects of the regime watched with growing alarm as the opposition mobilized its forces for the ultimate electoral showdown, setting the stage for a historic political battle that would alter the destiny of Chile forever. The year 1988 arrived in Chile with an air of electric tension and historic anticipation. The political calendar pointed toward a single defining date: October 5th, the day of the plebiscite mandated by the 1980 television constitution. For 15 years, General Augusto Pinochet had exercised absolute, unchecked authority over the nation, ruling through a combination of military decree, internal surveillance, and a state of perpetual emergency. Yet, the legal framework that he had constructed to legitimize his permanent grip on power now contained a single vulnerability. It required an up or down national referendum on whether a single military nominee, chosen by the Junta, should govern for another 8 years. The dictator and his inner circle approached the vote with supreme confidence, fully convinced that the machinery of the state, the fear of past chaos, and the memory of the early 1970s economic turmoil would secure a resounding victory for the regime. Inside the presidential palace and the military high command, the ruling authorities viewed the plebiscite not as a genuine democratic contest, but as an institutional confirmation of their historic mission. They believed that ordinary Chileans, despite voicing economic complaints during recent street protests, ultimately preferred stability, order, and national security over the uncertainties of civilian party politics. The government controlled the television networks, the radio stations, and the major newspapers, utilizing state media to project an image of unshakable strength, economic modernization, and patriotic duty. Government strategists anticipated that the opposition would remain fractured, timid, and incapable of mounting a coherent national campaign against an entrenched administration that held every institutional advantage. However, the opposition forces, having spent years enduring exile, clandestine organizing, and brutal repression, recognized that this plebiscite represented a rare, historic window of opportunity. Rather than succumbing to despair or boycotting the process, as they had done in past maneuvers, leaders from across the political spectrum, including Christian Democrats, socialists, liberals, and social democrats, forged an unprecedented alliance known as the Coalition of Parties for the No. This broad coalition understood that defeating an entrenched dictatorship required discipline, unity, and a strategic shift from angry street confrontation to persuasive electoral mobilization. They put aside past ideological bitter rivalries and committed themselves to a unified campaign that would convince a frightened and skeptical populace that change was not only possible, but safe. The centerpiece of the opposition strategy was a brilliant and unexpected weapon: television. Under the terms of the constitutional rules governing the plebiscite, both the yes and no campaigns were granted 15 minutes of uninterrupted television broadcast time every night during the final month before the vote. While government advisors initially urged a traditional, stern campaign focused on military achievements, order, and warnings of communist subversion, the opposition adopted a radically different approach. Led by creative directors, advertising experts, and media professionals, the No campaign produced a vibrant, upbeat, and joyful television broadcast. Instead of dwelling solely on the dark horrors of past human rights abuses, which could trigger fear and defensiveness among conservative voters, the broadcasts focused on hope, color, joy, and a future free of fear. Every evening across Chile, families gathered around television sets to watch a broadcast that felt entirely revolutionary in a country accustomed to military censorship and solemn official pronouncements. The No campaign featured catchy jingles, colorful rainbows symbolizing diversity and optimism, popular folk singers, actors, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life sharing their quiet hopes for a democratic future. A famous musical theme resonated through homes, teaching viewers that joy was coming back to the country. The contrast was stark and striking. While the official government broadcasts relied on stern military figures, graphs of economic growth, and stark warnings of chaos and Marxist subversion, the opposition offered an infectious message of national reconciliation, peace, and everyday human dignity. As the weeks of the campaign progressed, the momentum shifted visibly across the country. Neighborhoods that had previously been silent out of fear began to hum with quiet discussion. People wore rainbow badges on their lapels, distributed leaflets in public markets, and discussed the impending vote with a renewed sense of agency. The regime watched in growing disbelief and alarm as public support for the No campaign surged far beyond initial expectations. Privately, intelligence reports began to filter up to military commanders, indicating that the population was no longer afraid, and that the electoral outcome was far from the guaranteed coronation the dictator had anticipated. On the morning of October 5, 1988, millions of Chileans woke before dawn and walked quietly to neighborhood polling stations established across the country. The atmosphere outside voting centers was tense, watchful, and deeply solemn. Voters lined up patiently under the watchful gaze of military patrols and police officers, clutching their identification documents and whispering among themselves. International observers, foreign journalists, and domestic election monitors flooded into Santiago and regional capitals, establishing an unprecedented web of oversight designed to ensure that the vote count could not be altered or suppressed behind closed doors. Every ballot cast was an act of profound personal courage, representing years of accumulated grief, resistance, and hope for a different national destiny. As daylight faded and the polling stations closed their doors, a thick silence descended over the nation. The hours ticked by slowly as local ballots were tabulated at precinct tables across the country. Inside government headquarters, high-ranking military commanders and regime loyalists gathered in mounting anxiety as initial internal returns began to paint a picture that defied all official projections. The early counts, relayed securely from voting centers, showed a steady, undeniable lead for the no vote. As the night deepened, the official electoral service experienced unexplained delays in broadcasting the national totals, fueling widespread panic among citizens and opposition leaders who feared a military intervention or an attempt to manipulate the results. Fears of a backroom military maneuver reached a fever pitch late into the evening. Within the junta, divisions began to emerge between hardline generals who urged Pinochet to annul the results and deploy troops to secure the streets, and more pragmatic commanders who recognized that reversing a clear democratic verdict would plunge Chile into catastrophic civil conflict and international isolation. Crucially, key military leaders, including the head of the Air Force and members of the Army High Command, made it clear that they would not support an unconstitutional power grab. As independent radio networks and international news agencies began broadcasting reliable parallel tabulations showing a definitive victory for the no side, the reality of the situation became impossible for the regime to ignore. Near midnight, Interior Ministry officials finally released official figures showing that approximately 56% of voters had rejected Pinochet's continuation in power, while roughly 44% had voted yes. The opposition coalition headquarters erupted in ecstatic celebration as thousands of citizens poured into the streets of downtown Santiago, waving Chilean flags, weeping openly, embracing strangers, and chanting slogans of liberation. The long night of fear and authoritarian rule had reached a turning point. The ballot box, designed by the dictatorship to legitimize its permanent rule, had instead delivered a peaceful, legal verdict that forced the regime to accept the inevitable transition toward democracy. The morning of March 11, 1990, dawned bright and clear over Santiago, illuminating a capital city that felt as though it were waking from a long, heavy dream. For 17.5 years, the name of Augusto Pinochet had been synonymous with the supreme authority of the state, his portrait hanging in every government office, military barracks, and public building across the country. But today, the presidential sash was set to pass from the hands of the military general back to a democratically elected civilian leader. The transition, mandated by the very constitutional framework the regime had engineered a decade earlier, represented a unique compromise in modern Latin American history, a negotiated exit where an entrenched dictator stepped down from the executive office, while deliberately retaining institutional anchors designed to insulate him and his armed forces from future accountability. Preparations inside the National Congress building in Valparaiso, newly constructed to replace the old legislative halls in Santiago, hummed with a mix of solemn protocol and palpable nervous energy. Foreign dignitaries, international journalists, newly elected parliamentarians, and senior military officers filed into the grand chambers to witness a constitutional ritual that many Chileans had spent decades fighting to achieve. General Pinochet, wearing his immaculate dress uniform, adorned with medals and ribbons, arrived with his customary stoic expression. He maintained the rigid posture of a commander who still viewed himself as the savior of the nation, a man who had rescued Chile from economic ruin and Marxist chaos in 1973. Yet, beneath the formal military bearing, there was an unmistakable tension in the air as he prepared to hand over the presidential power to Patricio Aylwin, the veteran Christian Democratic leader who had won the presidency at the head of the broad Democratic coalition. The handover ceremony itself was brief, stiff, and laden with unspoken historical weight. As the presidential sash was transferred from the outgoing dictator to the newly sworn-in civilian president, the cameras flashed and recorded a moment that marked the formal closure of military rule. For millions of citizens watching on television screens across the nation, the gesture was profound, a tangible symbol that popular sovereignty and constitutional democracy had finally returned to Chilean soil. Yet, even as the applause echoed through the congressional hall, The political reality of the day served as a sobering reminder of the compromises required to achieve a peaceful transition. Pinochet was leaving the presidential palace of La Monda, but he was far from relinquishing all of his power. Under the terms of the 1980 Constitution, which the regime had successfully institutionalized before organizing the transition, Pinochet retained his position as commander-in-chief of the Chilean army. This single provision was not a mere administrative detail. It was a powerful structural safeguard, carefully engineered to ensure that the military retained an independent power base, capable of checking civilian authority. While President Aylwin assumed the formidable task of governing a deeply fractured nation, healing human rights wounds, and restoring full democratic norms, he did so with the constant, looming presence of the army chief, stationed just blocks away at the military headquarters. The general made it clear to his inner circle and to the incoming civilian administration that the armed forces considered themselves the ultimate guardians of the institutional order, ready to defend the legacy of the military regime against any radical reforms or attempts at sweeping retrospective prosecution. Back in Santiago, the mood in the streets was vastly different from the tense halls of power in Valparaiso. Thousands of joyous citizens flooded the public plazas and avenues, waving Chilean flags, singing songs of freedom, and celebrating the dawn of a new era. For families who had endured the loss of loved ones, years of political imprisonment, or the bitter cold of exile, March 11th was a day of profound emotional release. They cheered for democracy, for human rights, and for the possibility of a future where political dissent would no longer be met with state terror. Yet, as the celebrations unfolded beneath the afternoon sun, a quiet apprehension lingered among political leaders and human rights advocates. They knew that the transition was incomplete, hedged in by appointed senators, protected military budgets, and an entrenched commander-in-chief who still commanded the loyalty of thousands of armed troops. In the weeks and months that followed his departure from the executive mansion, Pinochet settled into his permanent command headquarters, maintaining a high-profile presence in national affairs. He frequently utilized his position as army chief to issue public warnings, comment on political debates, and exert subtle pressure on the civilian government whenever legislative proposals touched upon military prerogatives or human rights investigations. Whenever judges or prosecutors attempted to examine past abuses committed during the early years of the dictatorship, the military high command, under Pinochet's direct guidance, closed ranks, warning of institutional instability if the armed forces were subjected to legal inquiries. The civilian administration was thus forced to walk a delicate tightrope, balancing the urgent moral demand for truth and justice against the persistent threat of military unrest. This tense coexistence defined the early years of Chile's fragile democracy. The country was praised internationally for its successful economic growth and the peaceful transfer of executive power, yet it remained haunted by the ghosts of its authoritarian past. The institutional architecture built by the dictatorship, including a binary electoral system that favored conservative minorities, constitutional tribunals with veto power, and irremovable senators appointed by military bodies, ensured that Pinochet's ideological and political imprint would endure long after he left the government palace. He had lost the plebiscite, and he had surrendered the presidential sash, but through strategic foresight and institutional engineering, he had successfully preserved a formidable fortress of power from which he could continue to influence the destiny of the nation. In the autumn of 1998, General Augusto Pinochet traveled to Great Britain for medical care, carrying a diplomatic passport and expecting a quiet journey abroad. For years, the former dictator had operated under the assumption that his transition arrangement, combined with his lifetime senatorial immunity back home, effectively insulated him from the reach of international courts. Yet, while he convalesced at a London clinic following back surgery, a dramatic legal offensive orchestrated across national borders abruptly shattered his sense of invulnerability. On the night of October 16, 1998, British police acting on an international arrest warrant and an extradition request issued by Spanish magistrate Baltasar Garzón placed the 82-year-old former head of state under police guard. That sudden intervention sent shockwaves through diplomatic corridors, legal academies, and public squares around the globe, instantly thrusting the dark legacy of Chile's military regime back into the center of international attention. The legal mechanism that caught the general off guard was rooted in the developing doctrine of universal jurisdiction, the legal principle that certain crimes of such profound gravity as torture, terrorism, and crimes against humanity transcend national borders and can be prosecuted by any state regardless of where the acts occurred. Spanish courts, led by investigative judges pursuing accountability for European citizens and regional victims who had suffered during Latin America's coordinated military dictatorships, asserted their authority to examine the systemic abuses committed under Pinochet's command. When Scotland Yard officers executed the warrant at the London hospital, it marked a historic threshold. Never before had a former foreign head of state traveling on official diplomatic credentials been detained on foreign soil to face criminal proceedings for human rights violations. For thousands of Chilean exiles, relatives of the disappeared, and human rights advocates worldwide, the unexpected news was met with immense emotional catharsis, viewed by many as a long-overdue crack in an otherwise impenetrable wall of impunity. What followed was an extraordinary, prolonged legal and diplomatic saga that unfolded across British courts over the course of 16 months. Pinochet's defense team immediately mobilized, arguing that as a former sovereign head of state and a sitting senator, he was fully protected by diplomatic and sovereign immunity from foreign judicial interference. The case climbed through successive tiers of the British judicial system, resulting in historic hearings before the House of Lords, the highest court of appeal in the United Kingdom. Legal scholars, international jurists, and human rights organizations submitted extensive briefs, turning the British courtrooms into a global battleground over the limits of sovereign power and the accountability of authoritarian leaders. In a landmark ruling, the law lords ultimately determined that sovereign immunity could not shield a former leader from prosecution for international crimes such as systematic torture, establishing a powerful precedent that redefined the boundaries of international criminal law. Simultaneously, the arrest ignited an intense political storm within Chile itself, deeply polarizing the nation's fragile democracy. The civilian government, navigating a delicate political equilibrium under the watchful eye of domestic military commanders, formally protested the detention as an infringement upon national sovereignty and diplomatic protocol. Conservative political factions and military loyalists rallied behind the general, decrying the foreign proceedings as an intolerable affront to national dignity. Conversely, progressive groups, labor unions, and human rights organizations celebrated the detention, organizing rallies and demanding that he answer fully for the atrocities of the dictatorship. The spectacle of a once untouchable general fighting for his freedom in a British courtroom exposed the deep, unresolved fissures that still haunted Chilean society nearly a decade after the formal transition to civilian rule. As the extradition proceedings ground forward, questions regarding Pinochet's advanced age and deteriorating physical health took center stage. Medical examinations were commissioned, and British Home Secretary Jack Straw faced the immense responsibility of weighing competing legal, humanitarian, and diplomatic arguments. Ultimately, in March 2000, citing medical grounds and concluding that the aging general was unfit to stand trial or endure further extradition proceedings, the British government decided against sending him to Spain and permitted his return to Chile. Though he escaped foreign prosecution, the London arrest fundamentally altered his standing and permanently transformed the global legal landscape, proving that tyrants and dictators could no longer rest easy in the belief that time and political compromise would shield them forever from the pursuit of international justice. The return of Augusto Pinochet to Santiago in March 2000 marked the beginning of a complex, exhausting domestic reckoning that would dominate the final years of his life. When his aircraft touched down on Chilean soil, the scene vividly illustrated a divided nation. As he stepped out of the plane, cameras captured a striking, unexpected moment. The aging former dictator momentarily leaned on a cane before straightening up and walking down the steps under his own power. A gesture that immediately reignited fierce debates over whether his reported medical frailties had been exaggerated to avoid foreign justice. Waiting for him on the tarmac were loyal military officers and conservative political allies eager to welcome him back, while just beyond the airport gates, hundreds of protesters and families of the disappeared gathered in furious demonstration, chanting slogans and holding photographs of their missing loved ones. This polarized reception set the tone for what would unfold over the next several years, as the Chilean judicial system attempted to do what many had long believed was impossible: bring the once untouchable general to account within his own homeland. For decades, Pinochet had maintained a thick shield of legal protections, including the lifetime senatorial immunity he secured upon leaving the presidency, as well as the overarching de facto power wielded by the armed forces. Yet the political landscape of Chile was shifting beneath his feet. The revelations and international pressure generated by his London arrest emboldened local judges, human rights lawyers, and investigative reporters who had spent years quietly gathering evidence of abuses committed under the regime. Prosecutors and magistrates who had previously felt intimidated or blocked by military influence now sensed an opening to challenge the wall of impunity that had protected high-ranking officials since the transition to civilian rule in 1990. The legal offensive against Pinochet did not happen in a vacuum. It was propelled forward by a tireless coalition of victims, relatives, and specialized legal teams who systematically filed hundreds of individual criminal complaints. These lawsuits bypassed the blanket protections of past military amnesty laws by categorizing unresolved disappearances as ongoing kidnappings, a legal strategy arguing that since the victims' bodies had never been found and their fates remained officially unknown, the crime was actively continuing day after day. This crucial distinction allowed innovative judges to bypass statutory limitations and open formal criminal investigations into the highest echelons of the military government. Among the pioneering magistrates leading these investigations was Judge Juan Guzman Tapia, whose meticulous and courageous handling of the cases transformed him into a central figure in Chile's judicial history. Initially assigned to handle numerous complaints against Pinochet, Judge Guzman approached the monumental task with rigorous impartiality, earning the respect of legal scholars even as he faced intense pressure and intimidation from military hardliners. Under Guzman's direction, the courts began chipping away at the former dictator's defenses, demanding that he submit to judicial scrutiny, medical evaluations, and formal questioning. The central legal battleground quickly became the question of Pinochet's immunity. In the courts, human rights attorneys argued that crimes against humanity, such as forced disappearances and systematic torture, could not be shielded by constitutional privileges or political amnesties. They maintained that international legal obligations superseded domestic protections, echoing the fundamental principles that had been debated in the British House of Lords during the London extradition proceedings. Conversely, Pinochet's defense counsel fought tenaciously at every turn, filing endless motions, appealing to higher courts, and arguing that their client's advanced age, progressive dementia, and failing physical health rendered him entirely incapable of understanding or participating in a fair trial. The medical evaluations ordered by the courts became a theater of intense public scrutiny. neurologists, psychiatrists, and independent medical boards were repeatedly called upon to examine the octogenarian general. Reports painted a picture of a man suffering from mild vascular dementia, diabetes, arthritis, and heart conditions. Defense attorneys used these medical reports to argue that subjecting Pinochet to criminal proceedings would violate basic humanitarian principles and due process, as he could no longer properly instruct his lawyers or comprehend the complex charges against him. Yet prosecutors and victims' advocates countered that a full judicial accounting was necessary not only to punish past wrongs, but to establish an unalterable historical record of state-sponsored terror. The legal saga took dramatic twists and turns with each passing month. In the year 2004, the Santiago Court of Appeals made a historic ruling stripping Pinochet of his parliamentary immunity in connection with the Caravan of Death, a notorious military mission in 1973 that had executed political prisoners across northern Chile. This decision paved the way for formal indictments, house arrest orders, and unprecedented judicial interrogation of the former head of state. For the first time in Chilean history, a court of law was treating the architect of the military regime as an ordinary criminal suspect subject to the rule of law. Further legal blows followed as investigations expanded beyond the Caravan of Death to encompass financial corruption and hidden wealth. Subsequent inquiries by investigative journalists and judicial panels revealed that Pinochet and his family had amassed millions of dollars in secret foreign bank accounts, notably at the Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., using aliases, shell companies, and falsified documents. This stunning revelation severely tarnished his carefully cultivated public image as a stern, incorruptible patriot dedicated solely to the nation's salvation. Instead, the corruption scandals exposed a regime marred not only by brutal political repression, but also by profound financial enrichment at the public's expense, alienating many of his remaining conservative defenders who could no longer justify or excuse such personal enrichment. Throughout these turbulent legal battles, Pinochet remained a largely isolated figure within his suburban Santiago estate, occasionally emerging for brief medical checkups or issuing defiant statements through loyal family members and spokespersons. He never spent time in a traditional prison cell, instead serving periods of house arrest, while his lawyers successfully delayed final verdicts through medical appeals and procedural maneuvers. The Chilean court system moved with agonizing slowness, frustrated by legal technicalities, shifting judicial panels, and the ever-present shadow of the general's deteriorating health. For many victims and their families, the slow pace of justice was deeply painful, raising fears that the aging general would escape a formal courtroom verdict altogether. Yet, despite the absence of a final criminal conviction, the cumulative weight of the investigations fundamentally transformed how Chile viewed its recent past. The courts had officially broken the taboo of untouchability, establishing judicial precedents that made it clear no individual, regardless of how powerful they once were, stood entirely above the law. The ongoing legal proceedings forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths that many had preferred to bury in the name of political reconciliation. Archives were opened, secret testimonies were recorded, and the mechanisms of state terror were laid bare for the public to examine. The tireless efforts of judges, lawyers, and human rights organizations ensured that the crimes of the dictatorship could not simply be forgotten or swept aside by the passage of time. As the year 2006 drew to a close, Pinochet's physical condition continued its steep decline. On December 3rd of that year, following a sudden heart attack, he was rushed to the Santiago Military Hospital, where he was placed in the intensive care unit. Family members rushed to his bedside, and outside the hospital gates, small groups of supporters and detractors once again gathered, holding a nervous vigil over the final chapters of a life that had defined an entire era of modern Chilean history. On December 10, 2006, coincidentally International Human Rights Day, Augusto Pinochet passed away at the age of 91, taking with him secrets of command responsibility that many had hoped to hear extracted in a final court verdict. His death sparked an immediate and deeply divided national reaction. The government of President Michelle Bachelet, herself a former political prisoner and the daughter of an Air Force general who had died as a result of torture under the regime, refused to grant a state funeral with full honors, authorizing only a military funeral attended by his family, loyal armed forces commanders, and dedicated followers. Across Santiago and other major cities, spontaneous street celebrations erupted among opponents of the regime who saw his death as the closing of a dark chapter, while solemn memorial services were held by those who still credited him with saving the country from economic ruin and Marxist chaos. The legal processes against him were officially terminated by his death, leaving many individual criminal cases technically unresolved without a final judicial sentence. Yet the final reckoning left behind an enduring legacy of accountability. The investigations had successfully identified numerous co-conspirators, led to the conviction of several lower-ranking military and intelligence officers, and permanently embedded the principle of human rights protection into the fabric of Chile's democratic institutions. The unfinished legal battle demonstrated that, while justice can be painfully slow and imperfect, the pursuit of truth remains an essential pillar for any society striving to heal the deep wounds of tyranny and oppression. The death of Augusto Pinochet in December 2006 closed the book on a life that had fundamentally reshaped the destiny of Chile. Yet the nation he left behind remained profoundly divided over his legacy. Almost 2 decades after the transition to civilian rule, the shadow of the general's 17-year dictatorship continued to stretch across contemporary Chilean society, influencing its politics, its economy, its legal system, and its collective memory. Evaluating the legacy of Pinochet is an exercise in navigating deep contradictions, where opposing interpretations of history clash with irreconcilable moral frameworks. To his loyal supporters, military veterans, and conservative defenders, Pinochet remained the savior of the fatherland, the decisive leader who stepped forward in 1973 to rescue Chile from the brink of economic collapse, social anarchy, and totalitarian Marxist rule. They pointed to the drastic economic restructuring of the 1970s and 80s, arguing that the foundational reforms implemented by the Chicago Boys laid the groundwork for Chile's emergence as one of the most stable and prosperous economies in Latin America. From this perspective, the harsh measures of the military regime were viewed as a regrettable but necessary emergency surgery required to excise a dangerous cancer from the body politic. Supporters emphasized that unlike other authoritarian rulers in the region, Pinochet ultimately submitted to a democratic constitutional process through the 1988 plebiscite and stepped down from the presidency in 1990, allowing institutional normalcy to resume. Conversely, to the vast majority of human rights advocates, victims' families, and democratic citizens, Pinochet was remembered as a ruthless dictator who illegitimately seized power, dismantled a proud democratic tradition, and unleashed a systematic campaign of state-sponsored terror against his own people. They argued that no amount of economic growth or infrastructural development could ever wash away the stain of thousands of political murders, forced disappearances, systemic tortures, and arbitrary exiles. For these critics, the financial corruption scandals that emerged in his later years completely shattered the myth of the stern, incorruptible soldier, revealing a regime tainted by personal greed and abuse of power. The human cost of the dictatorship was not merely a matter of historical statistics. It remained an open, bleeding wound for families who spent decades searching for the remains of their disappeared loved ones, demanding truth and justice with unwavering persistence. The institutional legacy of the dictatorship proved remarkably resilient, anchoring fierce political debates well into the 21st century. The 1988 Constitution, crafted under the military regime to embed conservative checks and balances and preserve military autonomy, served as the supreme law of the land for decades. Although successive democratic governments introduced numerous amendments to remove authoritarian enclaves, civilian oversight mechanisms, and designated senatorial seats, the foundational framework of the state remained deeply tied to the Pinochet era. Generations of politicians debated whether true democracy could ever fully flourish under a constitutional architecture designed by a dictator. These tensions erupted into national prominence during major social upheavals, such as the massive public protests of 1919 and 21, where citizens took to the streets to demand a completely new constitution, dismantling the privatized pension systems, healthcare models, and educational structures engineered during the military regime. The economic model championed by Pinochet's technocrats generated a complex duality that divided economists and social scientists alike. On one hand, Chile achieved significant macroeconomic stability, low inflation, robust trade agreements, and an expanded middle class that set it apart from many of its neighbors. On the other hand, the aggressive privatization of public services, natural resources, and social safety nets created deep-seated socioeconomic inequalities. The system transformed essentials like water, education, and pensions into market commodities, leaving a vast portion of the working class vulnerable and heavily indebted. The ongoing debate over this economic legacy forced modern Chile to constantly weigh the benefits of market efficiency against the fundamental human right to social dignity and equity. Internationally, the Pinochet era and its aftermath left an indelible mark on global jurisprudence. The 1998 London arrest became a foundational milestone in the development of universal jurisdiction, establishing the critical legal precedent that heads of state and military dictators could not hide behind sovereign immunity when accused of crimes against humanity. Human rights lawyers and international organizations frequently cited the Pinochet case as a turning point that empowered courts around the world to pursue authoritarian leaders across borders, signaling that impunity was no longer an absolute guarantee for those who abused state power. Within Chile, the domestic judiciary underwent a profound internal transformation as a direct consequence of the legal battles fought against Pinochet and his subordinates. Judges and magistrates who had initially looked away during the dark days of the regime gradually found their institutional courage, building a robust body of case law that prioritized international human rights conventions over domestic amnesties. The relentless pursuit of accountability by specialized judges, human rights lawyers, and investigative journalists ensured that the crimes of the dictatorship were systematically documented, investigated, and prosecuted, leading to hundreds of convictions of former intelligence agents and military officers. This judicial reckoning demonstrated that a society could slowly reclaim its moral compass through the painstaking work of truth and law. As modern Chile looks toward its future, the ghost of Augusto Pinochet continues to provoke reflection, debate, and emotional resonance. Memorials dedicated to the victims of the dictatorship stand in quiet plazas across Santiago, serving as solemn reminders of the cost of tyranny, while occasional gatherings of conservative loyalists still honor the general's memory on historical anniversaries. The enduring division over his legacy highlights a universal truth. History is never simply written by the victors. It is continuously negotiated by the living. The story of Pinochet's rise and fall remains a stark, cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy, the dangerous allure of authoritarian control, and the unyielding resilience of human rights. It leaves behind an enduring question that every generation of Chileans and citizens around the world must continually answer: how a nation can acknowledge its dark